The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He's also the author of 16 books, including State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson Lichtenstein, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote a piece for The Nation titled, What Next for Amazon Workers? And you described the failure to unionize Amazon workers at the Bessemer plant in Alabama in April as more a confirmation of Amazon's power than an indication of the willingness of its employees to organize for collective action. What gave Amazon the upper hand in this campaign?
Well, it's over the years, there have been so much transformation of the labor law in a direction toward helping employers and Amazon is such a large and sophisticated company that it was sort of overdetermined that they would win. And I think the enormous attention that was paid to this campaign in the media and elsewhere came away from the sense that this was not like, oh, the workers decided they didn't want a union. What came out of it was that the various tools that Amazon had, everything from captive audience meetings where workers are forced to attend anti-union talks, to the way in which Amazon tried to keep workers away from handing out leaflets, all sorts of things. We could go on for hours about that. The net result was that people came away from that. I think the general public was, Amazon has too much power, as do many of the other tech companies, and it's sort of the playing field was tilted so heavily against the workers that it's not a surprise that they lost.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the next step, you suggest that a revival of antitrust advocacy could work in organized labor's interest. First, where are we seeing this advocacy being expressed, and why now?
Well, we are seeing it. It's been taking place for a few years now, but recently President Biden just made it absolutely formal. He appointed a 32-year-old associate professor of law from Columbia, Lena Khan, to head the Federal Trade Commission, and she wrote a path-breaking article called "Amazon's Antitrust Paradox." I'll get to that in a second. And so she's has the official position of in charge of antitrust in the United States government, which is quite remarkable. And then there are other people as well in the Biden administration who have this who see antitrust as important. Now, here's the way it links to labor, and I think this is where a little history is appropriate. In the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, and then in the early 20th century, and the idea of antitrust, breaking up the big, monopolies, the steel trust or the meat packing trust, et cetera. These trusts were kind of quasi monopolies. Was linked not to lower prices. Although it's true, Rockefeller kept the price of oil up, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was these big companies had too much power raw power to corrupt the Senate, power over their workers, power to fleece farmers, and that was part of the world of the populists and the progressives and the New Dealers as well. That antitrust was seen as, or as a way of cutting back the power of private industry that was sort of we just had too wealthy, too much power, etc. There's also the issue was that many of these companies, and not just electric utilities, for example, or telephone companies 100 years ago, they were utilities. That is, everyone had to, they provided a service that was essential for everyone, railroads, for example, clean water, etc. And therefore, they were properly subject to government regulation. So that was 100 years ago. Now, what happened in the meantime, especially from the 1950s and 60s on, was that antitrust became narrowed down, became a very technical question, was mainly, the issue was, are the prices too high? If a big company, is able to lower prices, okay, no problem. Robert Bork, you may remember him. He was the conservative nominee to the Supreme Court who didn't make it. But Bork was a theorist and advocate of this point of view, and it flourished in the 1980s and really in the 90s under Clinton and continuing. That the idea being that the only criteria for worrying about bigness is the price too high? Well, Amazon does in fact, and Walmart, for example, another example, they have low prices. So on that criteria, no problem. Amazon is fine. They have low prices. Don't worry. What's your problem with them? But obviously, I think the Bessemer situation and others have shown that they have this power, this political, economic power, which is not just a question of consumer welfare, but worker welfare and just community welfare, et cetera. And so this issue, which again, 100 years ago, antitrust was linked to the rights of labor. I think that's happening again today. And I think that issue is on the agenda, as it were, right now. And Linda Kahn, the new head of the Federal Trade Commission, in her extensive writings about Amazon, makes that point directly.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, as you were talking about, these big companies are keeping the prices down. So what's your problem? It kind of reminds me of the, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Right.
As you write in the article, this isn't the first time there's been an antitrust movement in the United States. How does this moment compare to the impulse and vision of that history?
Well, I think today it's just getting started again, and I just saw a article in the paper that all the tech companies and Amazon are mobilizing an army of lawyers to fight the contemporary efforts to curb them. But back in the 30s, let's say the 30s and the progressive era, 1930s, the New Deal, Roosevelt himself. And Biden has as well made the argument that, the big companies, have too much power. It wasn't just that prices are too high, but they have too much power. And one incident that I like to reference is this, that back in the 30s, the chain stores were a new phenomenon, and they were very big, and lots of people didn't like them. Chain stores were not unlike, tech. A&P had 15,000 little stores, putting all sorts of small proprietors out of business. And and there was a lot of agitation in Congress and elsewhere to break up the chain stores, the same way that today breaking up tech. And so A&P, which was the largest in those days and really gigantic, was subject to that critique. Well, it's complicated, but they cut a deal essentially with the unions, and the unions, they agreed, we'll allow you, we'll stop resisting unionization of A&P in return for which the unions would sort of at least not be part of this breaking up A&P or curbing it. And I think that was a good deal in this way, that one place where unionism and high wages and good conditions flourish is when wages are taken out of competition, when you do in fact have big business, but which is unionized and regulated. So, example, the big auto companies back in the 1950s and 60s, they set the pace for good wages and more unionization. And the same would be true of, say, electrical utilities or railroads when they were flourishing. They're kind of monopolies. They're kind of utilities. They're regulated, and that means wages are taken out of competition, and so unionism can flourish. Well, I think the other aspect of contemporary thinking about big tech and other companies is Google and Facebook and Amazon. These are really utilities. They're utilities. They're like the electric company. They're like the water system. Everyone, you have to have it. I mean, you can't live without plugging into Google. And so therefore they are properly to be regulated. And if they're to be regulated, then all sorts of things can come under regulation. And they're already monopolies in effect. So why have $15, have $30 wages at Amazon, or et cetera? So I think that dynamic is on the table, and I think it can be pushed forward today.
We're speaking to Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy, and also the author of, among many books, State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson, you also write that breaking up big companies such as Amazon would actually do little to advance unionization, while the threat of antitrust action could. What led you to this conclusion?
Yeah, well, right. Well, a couple of things. Well, these companies are so gigantic that you cut them in half, they're still gigantic. I mean, you don't solve that problem. They're still huge. You cut them in thirds, they're still gigantic. So that's one part of it. The second is that I think the threat that is the business model of these companies. They're very this is the key thing, and we've seen this with Uber and Lyft. The effort in California and other places to really regulate them and to establish some standards on a statewide basis, and then just sent them ballistic, and they actually put all this money into a referendum, which ended up negating what the legislature wanted to do. But we can see there that their business model was actually crucial, and if you can threaten that, then you can really put the fear of God into some of these big companies, and then unionization or doubling their wages is the lesser evil. It's the lesser evil than the regulation you might want. And so actually, and in fact, Uber and Lyft have been, I think, in a bad way, have been making overtures to labor for various things that we'll set up some union or something like that. They aren't very good deals they put forward thus far, but nevertheless they've been doing that, and that alone shows me that they want to preserve their business model at all costs. And in some cases, I think that's a good idea. In other cases, not. I think with Uber and Lyft, their business model is so rotten, I think we should just destroy it. But that's not the case of Google or Facebook. I mean, I think regulation is appropriate there.
This almost sounds like history repeating itself from what you said earlier about 100 years ago, where it's kind of here's the deal that we can give you because this is the lesser of two evils.
We live in a capitalist society, and there's some things remain the same. Just because you have a exciting piece of iPad in front of you doesn't mean that certain principles don't apply. And I think that yes, when unionization does surge forward, and it does periodically, every 2 or 3 generations, it's because companies see it as the lesser evil. They see it as the alternative is revolution or chaos or something of that sort. And so, and unions, in fact, this is what industrial relations people used to say, and it's still true in some places like Canada and some parts of Europe. Unionism is a stabilizing force. It takes certain issues out of contention and regularizes and routinizes other kinds of conflict.
Do you have a sense that labor organizers already understand this dynamic and how they can build this into their strategy?
Well, to a degree, I mean, labor is in such on the defensive, and they're scrambling so hard to just keep up with what's happening that it's hard for them to be strategic. But I mean, I think, yes, in some circles, unquestionably, and this is being debated to a degree. There's a debate going on actually in the on pages of some magazines, The Nation among them. Should these big tech be completely broken up? Should labor? Just what I've been saying is sort of subject to debate. So I think there is a debate going on. I wouldn't say it's the main focus that labor is pushing today. That's not the case, but I think they're aware of this issue. Yes.
Now, before we end, I think we should recognize the development in the campaign to unionize Amazon workers. The Teamsters have now taken this on. Do you have a sense that this will actually mean something for workers?
Well, the Teamsters are a bigger union. They do have more resources than the retail clerks who tried last time. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, the Teamsters have a reputation of, guys are tough guys and all that, but they've lost their share of battles as well. So I think it's good that this union is deciding to put some resources into this. If anything, it means that it keeps Amazon on their toes, and they'll incrementally, improve conditions so as to avoid unionization. Whether it certainly is not a sure thing. There's no sure thing. The biggest union in the country, the SEIU or the AFT, when they decide to have a campaign, it doesn't mean at all they're going to succeed. There's the phrase "big labor," which is bandied about. It doesn't exist really. Even the biggest trade union is not powerful compared to the larger corporations or other institutions of that sort. So yes, I'm glad they're doing it, and it will keep Amazon on their toes. That's for sure.
And David and Goliath will continue to live on as a story in the business world, I guess.
Unions have always they need the state on their side, and they had it in the 1930s and to a degree in the 1960s. And I think it's time now for the state to weigh in on the side of labor. And Biden, is aware of that.
Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast, his latest book, or State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson, we appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
I think we can now say the obvious. The Republican Party has gone bull goose bonkers. Its leaders have turned the once proud GOP brand into an unprincipled gaggle of corporate profiteers, hatemongers, and screwball conspiracy theorists. They're so far out that the Hubble Telescope couldn't find them. But where is my Democratic Party? Here's a transformative opportunity to forge a solid political coalition, a multiracial, urban-rural, farm-labor alliance based on fundamental principles and programs of fairness and opportunity for all. Isn't that what the party says it stands for? This is the prime time to demonstrate it, to reach out and unite ordinary Americans behind a national agenda of lasting progressive change. It's not like the party elders would have to start from scratch, for an energized, feisty movement of grassroots battlers against corporate greed and government injustice is already organizing, winning, and growing popular support all across the country. But rather than welcoming and building on the exciting advances of these popular movements, the party's old-line insider clique of big funders, consultants, and corporate politicos passively assume that the GOP's goofiness and nastiness will turn off enough voters that Democrats can win by default. Meanwhile, the establishment insists that Democrats only push modest incremental reforms so as not to offend corporate funders or spook moderate Republicans. Hello, brilliant strategists. A primary function of the Democratic Party is to offend the corporate powers. Also, there are only about 6 moderate Republicans left in America, so appeasing them is not a big win. especially when it costs you the support of grassroots voters eager for a politics bold enough and big enough to end business as usual economics. This is Jim Hightower saying, as our own history teaches, it takes intentional gutsiness to create a politics that matters. Republicans won't do that. Will Democrats?
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. He previously served as legislative director for former Congressman George Miller. Dan Maurer, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us as well. You know, the president wants to quit or substantially change the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Is that something you welcome?
Yeah, to be quite frank, the way we view it is that our trade policy, including NAFTA, has been built not to benefit American workers or workers elsewhere, but instead to benefit the interests of multinational corporations. And that's reflects how the process has gone. A lot of times these negotiations have been very secretive, and corporate insiders have had special access. And no surprise, the people with special access have gotten deals written to their benefit. What we've seen is lost jobs and lower wages as a result. So we think that it needs really a substantial rewrite to actually put the interests of workers and communities in the environment first. Whether we'll actually see that is still tough to know from my end. As you've seen, the president has not been very friendly to workers or communities or the environment in areas from healthcare to taxes to labor law to Wall Street reform and everything in between. So we hope that we do really see an effort at a rewrite that puts working families first, but we still, I think the ball remains out a little bit on that question.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned job creation or job losses. I was under the impression that NAFTA has actually created more jobs than have been lost. Is that inaccurate?
I think that is inaccurate. Yeah, I think this is a common misconception that gets pushed by people, by the same interests who like the status quo. And so they don't want to see changes that would really fix things. If you look at what we've seen about 900,000 workers have gotten what's called trade adjustment assistance benefits. That's the benefits you get from the government if your job's shipped overseas. And those 900,000 are due to NAFTA alone. We think the number is actually a lot bigger than that because a lot of workers, like call center workers, for much of the time in that program have not been eligible. And other workers may not know that they're eligible, or they may simply not be able to show. If you're trying to deal with getting your life together after your job's been shipped away. you may not have the wherewithal to figure out what exactly happened to it. At the same time, we've seen a dramatic expansion in our trade deficit with Mexico in specific. We had a pretty even trade balance, and now we have a trade deficit of almost $60 billion per year with Mexico. That's largely just because companies have found that in Mexico, workers are denied rights. They have very low wages, very few protections, and so they realize that if they move jobs there, they can increase their profits by exploiting Mexican workers. And so we've seen this effect all throughout the economy. And I think, certainly we have to have trade with the world, right? We can't, including with Mexico, including with Canada, but we need to have it if we want to create jobs, we need to do it in a way that is structured to create jobs and to benefit workers.
Mm-hmm. Do you look at NAFTA, which so now NAFTA is about 25 years old, give or take.
Right.
Has it affected how has that affected the ability of U.S. unions to organize? Has it hurt them drastically?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really interesting question that far too often gets overlooked because the job losses themselves are very important, but we also need to see what happens to other workers, right? And we see this at CWA very often. Increasingly our members, whether they be in manufacturing or at call centers or elsewhere, their jobs can be done anywhere. And when we're negotiating, we're trying to get a new contract, if we're trying to get better wages or we're trying to get better benefits and pensions and health care, at some point companies say, well, you know what, if you want all of that, then what we're going to do is we're going to move jobs to a place where we can exploit workers a lot better, like Mexico. And NAFTA has really facilitated that. And I think that's actually, we've seen that in a systematic way. There was a really interesting study out of Cornell University that found that threats to send jobs overseas in the face of union organizing drives tripled after NAFTA went into effect, which makes some sense because NAFTA greases the skids for companies to move jobs to lower wage countries. And so when we get pitted against workers in other countries, that makes it very hard for unions to organize and bargain and create better benefits, even though, what we know is those workers are not our enemy, right? It's the companies are trying to pit us against one another, but they've been very successful at doing it, and you see that in the drop in the rates of unionization and in the wage stagnation you've seen throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and also serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee. So 25 years ago, NAFTA was a pretty well-intended trade deal, Dan, was it not? But how much has technology affected NAFTA and kind of all of a sudden made it, not such a great thing?
I think in the concept of trying to work together with Mexico and Canada, that conceptually is a really great thing. I think I think the rules of the road are really important because if you set the rules wrong, you're not going to get a good result. But on technology, and I think that's part of the problem with NAFTA. But on technology, and in particular, you see the automation and offshoring actually go hand in hand. People often argue about, well, did you lose jobs due to automation? Did you lose jobs due to offshoring? And we know that the real answer is both. We see huge trade deficits of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. That's not a direct result of automation. That can't be, right. So that offshoring we know plays a role. At the same time, we know that in a lot of factories, for example, you can have just a few workers doing the work that maybe 20 workers would have been doing 20 years ago. But one thing that we see that's really important that ties all this together is that when you have this threat of companies being either themselves threatening to offshore jobs to countries with low wages, or facing competition from companies that do that, they need to cut costs. And so it encourages automation. And as technology has picked up, you end up seeing that these threats of automation and offshoring are oftentimes end up having a sort of symbiotic relationship where the two things are not. It's not a question of did automation cause your problems or did a bad trade deal cause your problems, but often the two really worked hand in hand to take away bargaining power from workers.
And something else, what about the environmental and health effects of NAFTA in Central America?
Yeah, that's actually something that is really an underrated aspect of it. We see NAFTA sets up these special tribunals that allow companies to challenge laws that they don't like. In practice, those are often environmental or public health laws, and sometimes labor laws as well. And that's one of the main points I was making in terms of NAFTA being set up to benefit the interests of multinational corporations, not workers. And we've seen that there's been a lot of research showing that these tribunals create a chilling effect on companies wanting to create public interest laws. They also have been used many times throughout Central America to, especially by mining companies that want to create mines that are going to have really damaging effects on the water supplies and clean water, and so that's a really big problem. Because if you can't set up good rules to protect clean water, you're going to see a lot of direct impacts. The other thing is that NAFTA has had really, really weak environmental standards. And what that means is that you get a race to the bottom, not just in terms of worker rights, but also in terms of environmental standards. So there's a lot of goods where we have in the U.S., for example, we've set better standards on lead in a lot of processes and products, and Mexico's standards are about only 1/10 as good. So you can have 10 times as much lead. And as you see some of these industries move to Mexico, you see high lead contamination, and you see really negative impacts on the public health of kids there. For the same reason that you see problems with lead in Flint and other communities across our country, even with our somewhat better standards. So it's I think the interests of workers go hand in hand with the interests of people who care about the environment as far as NAFTA is concerned.
Yeah. Now, in general, you, of course, advocate for workers' rights to be as globalized as is the capital that moves across borders. But how would that work or even be enforced?
Absolutely. That's something that has really arisen more recently as a major point, as we've seen how companies have used trade agreements to pit workers in one country against another. What we see in NAFTA, for example, is that companies have the same rights to move if they open up a factory in Canada, the U.S., or in Mexico. You don't have much in the way of labor standards at all, but to the extent you do have labor standards in other trade deals, they tend to only be concerned with just how are labor standards doing in this country. They're doing okay. Okay, how are labor standards doing in another country? But you don't have rights guaranteed for workers to organize across companies, across countries. At CWA, we represent workers at AT&T, for example. AT&T has numerous call centers opened up in Mexico, some of them serving the U.S. Our vision is that we should be able to work with the few independent unions in Mexico that do represent workers' interests, and we should be able to bargain together to advance our interests with AT&T. I think you can write those guarantees right into the trade agreement. You can say that if you have operations in both countries as a company, you have to respect the rights of workers to bargain together. And we've seen that in practice happen at times, but there's no guarantee by law that CWA works very closely with Las Telefonistas, which is one of the few independent unions in Mexico. the United Steelworkers, one of America's other great unions, works very closely with Los Mineros, one of the other few independent unions. But we don't have legal protections for those relationships, so that really is why we think that those should be guaranteed in a fully enforceable way in a new NAFTA.
Now, globalization, Dan, is not something that can nor should be stopped. But do we need laws and treaties to make it fairer for workers, or perhaps a new template of technological, educational, or economic change?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that question. Globalization is here to stay, and done right, it can be a benefit and bring people together and help raise wages and create jobs all over the world if we take advantage of all of our different strengths and work with people across countries. But I think that it's been shown that the current model hasn't worked, and it's had really bad economic effects, and it's also had bad political effects here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere. So I think what we need to do is come up with a new framework that puts the interests of workers first in trade agreements. And then when we do that, we can see that will benefit workers here in the U.S. and here and throughout the world. But until we do that, we're going to keep on seeing these threats of, if the question is pitted of the status quo or just trying to cut off globalization altogether, I think you're going to see this continued interest in cutting off globalization altogether, which is why we really need some real strong laws and protections that protect the interests of workers.
Okay. Dan Maurer, legislative representative for the Communications Workers of America, and serves as a liaison on the U.S. Trade Representatives Labor Advisory Committee, our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Dan, we appreciate your time with us, and we do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome, and thanks for being with us. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Kind of a big difference between the way Republicans think about Zelensky today and the way they thought about Zelensky when Donald Trump was trying to extort money from him, right?
Yeah, it really is extraordinary. I mean, every Republican in both chambers, except for Mitt Romney, voted to exonerate Donald Trump for extorting Zelensky by withholding the very kind of military aid that we are rushing to them now, until he agreed to manufacture dirt on Biden. And you don't really see a lot of contrition among Republican members of Congress saying maybe that was the wrong thing to do. It is. I was listening to a focus group the other day of young voters, and literally none of them, that an organization was holding a focus group, and sometimes they let journalists listen in. Literally none of them remembered that it was for extorting Ukraine that Trump was impeached the first time. But look, not hard to make this relevant in a midterm election, but I do think it would be relevant if Donald Trump runs again, if he's the Republican nominee.
Right. And there are, even now Trump has backed off a little bit, but there are Republicans out there who have been flat out pro-Putin. Your friend of mine, Tucker Carlson, right?
Yeah, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and
right.
Look, the Marjorie Taylor Greene comments are even more interesting to me in some ways than Tucker because Kevin McCarthy is essentially protecting her. I mean, he is refusing to discipline her in any way. I wrote early last year, that if you look at kind of public opinion attitudes, the extremist wing of the GOP has become too big to fail. I think it's become too big for what we would consider the mainstream party leadership to discipline because it represents too big a share of the base to get into a fight with. And it's a piece of the base and it's elected officials who are operating under, I think, the explicit protection of Trump. So, when McCarthy says that, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to get her committees back and is going to get better committees. And, this is someone who is essentially parroting Russian lines, about the war. It is a separate conversation and maybe relevant to the broader conversation we're having, is that over my career covering politics, and I don't really fully know the answer to this, although I have a few thoughts, Republicans have been more successful at making kind of the median average Democrat pay a price for the words and deeds of the most extreme members of the caucus to a far greater extent than Democrats have been able to do that to Republicans. I mean, you don't see Marjorie Taylor Greene being hung around the neck effectively of Republicans in swing districts in the fall, basically saying, okay, if you elect this person, this is who you're empowering. Republicans have had a lot more success at doing that, with Democrats than vice versa. And I'm not sure I fully understand why.
No, they sure have. And they've done it successfully and still do it successfully. Look at the squad, right? I mean,
right.
As Nancy Pelosi said once, there are 4 votes, but for the Republicans, they say these are the people who are running the country.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it is more of a team sport than it used to be, right? I mean, it is more of a quasi-parliamentary system. People don't vote as much in comparing to individuals. They're voting more about which party they want to be in control. But as Pelosi said, it's 4 votes. And now Republicans have done a pretty good job over the years of finding those 4 votes, whoever they are, and Pelosi herself is often it, and basically saying to voters in, kind of center right places, are these the people you really want to put in power? It'll be now that you have such an obvious foothold or beachhead for the extremist wing of the GOP inside the Congress, and you have McCarthy protecting them and sending clear signals that he is not going to rein them in or discipline them. It'll be interesting to see if Democrats can do the opposite more effectively than they have historically.
Well, we'll see if that develops as an issue in 2022, as you just pointed out. But one thing that Republicans certainly are building branding as an issue. I just call it book burning, right? Or book banning. I mean, and it started in Virginia, of course, when Terry McAuliffe infelicitously perhaps said parents shouldn't be deciding what their kids can read in school. But this has now become state after state after state, a serious movement, right? Tennessee, across the board.
No,
what's that all about?
It is what we are seeing in the schools is an incredibly broad and serious movement, and it is itself just one component of a broader offensive that is going on in the red states. So you have 23 states, almost half the states, where Republicans have unified control of government. And I would argue to you that what we are seeing across those states, with the support of the Republican majority on the Supreme Court and critical defense being provided by Republicans in the Senate wielding the filibuster, what we are seeing is the governors and legislatures in those Republican-controlled states working across a broad range of issues to roll back the rights revolution of the past 6 decades. I really think it's nothing less than that. I mean, the general trajectory, not telling you anything you don't know, but the general trajectory of American life since the 1960s, both in Supreme Court decisions and in congressional actions, has been to nationalize more rights, to increase the number of basic civil rights and liberties that are available to Americans in every state, and to reduce the ability of states to trim or diverge from those rights. So we're talking about everything from the criminal justice rulings, the Miranda rights in the 1960s, the Supreme Court establishing the right to privacy and ending state bans on contraception, the Supreme Court ending the state bans on interracial marriage, the Supreme Court nationalizing the right to abortion and later nationalizing the right to same-sex marriage, and congressional actions, obviously, over the years, ending segregation in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act, Title IX on gender discrimination in the 70s, the Americans with Disabilities Act under George H.W. Bush. across a whole range, a broad range of basic liberties and rights that affect how we live, the general trend has been that we are raising the floor of national rights that are available in every state and reducing the ability of states to restrict those rights. And what we are seeing with an incredible speed since 2021, I believe, is a broad effort in the red states to unravel that 6-decade tradition. I mean, we are seeing states that are moving to restrict abortion, moving to restrict voting rights, banning transgender girls from high school sports, now banning parents from providing care for transgender youth. We are seeing increased limits on protesting. We are seeing restrictions on what teachers can say, as you noted, about race and gender and now sexual orientation in the classroom. We are seeing book banning across, we're talking about half a dozen fronts or more. Many of the 23 red states are pursuing multiple of these paths, and some places like Florida or Tennessee or Texas are doing almost all of them. And it is I think the magnitude of what's happening, because there has been so much going on at the national level. I think no one is fully comprehending the magnitude of what's happening, but it is possible that we will get as soon as the end of this legislative session and feel that we have taken a giant step back toward a pre-60s world, toward a 50s world in which your basic freedoms vary enormously depending on where you live, which is something that we have generally been reversing, since at least the 1960s. And you could argue since the Supreme Court applied the Bill of Rights to the states, which was in the 1940s. So it's extraordinary what's happening. And I don't think there is enough attention to it at any level. Although I will say the Biden administration is engaging much more on these fights now than they were 6 months ago.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.